residents down front, please. Okay, guys, in the third and fourth row, everybody come on down. Just one more row, please. We got to fill these. Let's do these 3 rows here.
I think so. I'm just trying to get this. So I had an issue with like the tech guy or whatever just come down.
Okay. Have they
Having
been
trouble.
down?
No.
Okay.
I
Let me
talked
grab
about
it.
it might be okay. Yeah. Right. Okay.
Is it?
I
Do
have
you have
like
videos?
so no, it's just it's a straightforward PowerPoint. I have a jump drive. I'll send it to my email too. So
Will it not connect to the
yeah,
internet? If it's in your email, can we save it
it's
from there? Or is it a
yeah
link?
yeah. I have it on Flash. It's in, but then it said you had to have a password to how to do that.
Unless it's that password
Oh,
there.
ULH pass. You know what the user login is?
Another that one. Which one is it?
Might be the M drive.
Hello, this is Tim. We might have found it. We're having a hard time getting.
I'd have him come on down if he can. There we
Chris
go.
says if you can come
Oh
on
yes.
down to
Oh,
the
thank you.
site.
Let's see if we can work it.
Okay.
That should be it.
Thanks.
I think
We might have just done it.
I'm doing it. I'm doing it on technology, and you're like, I don't even know how to like load the PowerPoint.
Oh, trust me, I'm challenged.
Like a lifesaver. Appreciate it.
Oh no. Let's see. Hopefully it works. You're taking sweet time.
I know. I know.
Like, come on. Actually, the picture did move along. I thought. So you want me starting to wait a bit more? I'm gonna save this to the desktop too, just to because that's a very good one. Still good here too. Okay. It's still saying it's loading, but it's not.
It took a while to send and attach.
You have
I think.
video in there?
No. A couple like high res photos, which might be.
It's great.
It's all right. Just walk up and
Yeah,
touch
no
it, and it'll be like, "Woo." Okay, work your magic, Greg.
I think
It won't
should
even
be
be in this,
loading.
but now it's too far, but it won't.
It might just take a while.
He doesn't have any videos from it.
Yeah.
It's on the flash drive, and I saved it to the desktop. That's all people who didn't need my reminder about bringing it. Something like a constant nightmare.
Yeah.
Aha. Well,
Is it? No. I have a
just
flash.
bring it around. Yeah. Saying 88%.
89. Oh, there we go. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, there we go.
There you go.
Looks great.
Yeah,
Just want
no
to look
problem.
over it real quick. Make sure the formatting is correct.
Talking about staying close to the microphone.
Oh yeah,
For VA.
sure. Very good. Thanks. Thank you.
Good morning, soon to be afternoon. Welcome again. This is a great pleasure today. This starts off our series of scholarly presentations by our fourth year residents. The first one out of the chute will be Dr. Joshua Moore. It's a pleasure to introduce him. I've known him since he was a medical student. His topic today has a bit of interest for me as well, and hopefully many of you. Dr. Moore is finishing our program, as I mentioned, and may be joining us faculty, we're hopeful, very soon. He has had some research experience. He got his undergraduate degree in biology from the University of Kentucky, finished his doctor, MD in 2015 here at University of Louisville. He's going to be talking to us this morning about technology and mental health, past, present, and future. Please welcome Dr. Moore.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out today. Like Dr. Caudell mentioned, subject today will be technology and mental health. We'll be doing a bit of a review of the history of technology and how it relates to psychiatry. Talk some about current modern. Sure. Is this better? All right. Then I'll speak some about current modern day kind of applications of technology and psychiatry, and then future developments. And here's just kind of an outline of the subjects we'll be discussing today. Kind of start off with like a history of computing, origins. Yeah. Oh yeah, is that better? Okay. Just a bit of an outline, talk about the history of computing, origins of telemedicine, history of telepsychiatry, telepsychiatry as is practiced today, again, future developments, and talk some about the drawbacks of technology and mental health. All right, so I figured I'd start off with a quote. Seems like the appropriate thing to do for one of these kind of presentations. The only way of discovering the limits of the possible is to venture a little way past them into the impossible. In any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And that's from the science fiction author Arthur C. Clarke. I believe he wrote Space Odyssey 2001, among many other works of science fiction. So that was applicable to the discussion today. So figured it'd be good to kind of start by defining technology. It's from the Greek techne, and meaning art or skill or craft, and logia, account or explanation. Couldn't really settle on one particular definition of technology, so I included several that I found. One is that it's the science of craft. Another definition is the branch of knowledge that deals with the creation and use of technical means and their interrelation with life, society, and the environment, drawing upon such subjects as industrial arts, engineering, applied science, and pure science. And then third definition, the study and knowledge of the practical, especially industrial use of scientific discoveries. So humans have had a long, very millennia-long relationship with technology. I think it's kind of what makes humans human, this kind of drive to discover new things, to make tools. It's kind of what differentiates us from a lot of other species. The course of technology is there have been thousands of developments over the millennia that have each led to improvements in lifespan, quality of human life, as well as population growth. Started off with stone tools, then man discovered fire, able to clothe himself, later discovered metal tools, the wheel, plumbing, sanitation, centuries later, and then up to really the present day, the use of electricity and computers. So it's been this kind of centuries-long course of improvement. Here's just kind of a graph that kind of shows that there's a pretty huge spike in the world population, particularly over the last couple of centuries, which could be largely attributable to improvements in technology. Here's another chart that shows the improvements in human life expectancy over the last couple of millennia. You know, back in the several, thousands of years ago, it was like 20, mid 20s, and then gradually improved again, particularly over the last couple of centuries as we've this rapid growth in technology. So I figured it would be good to kind of go do a little bit of a history of computing, just to kind of, since computer, the telepsychiatry obviously involves computers. So I figured it'd be interesting to kind of see, well, how do we get to where we are today? What's the history of that? What are, what are the beginnings? So the abacus is probably the earliest known calculating device, still in use today. Dates back to at least 1100 BCE. I'm sure everybody here has probably seen one. It's composed of a rectangular frame with parallel rods on it that has sliding beads that each bead has represented by a different unit. This allows mathematical operations to be used in bookkeeping, things like addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. It was kind of a pretty significant breakthrough when it was developed. Can be also thought of as the first digital device that represents numbers discretely. Another major invention, or not really invention, but discovery, was the discovery of logarithms in 1614 by John Napier, who's a Scottish scientist. The discovery of logarithms allowed for a reduction in the time needed for multiplying numbers with many digits. If you were doing any kind of significant calculations in fields like trigonometry or astronomy or physics or anything like that, can be very helpful. Here's just like a little sample of a table of logarithms that was published in the 17th century. Another major development, kind of precursor to modern day computing, was the slide rule. It was developed by William Oughtred in the 17th century, with later refinements up until the 1800s. It's a device which can be used to make mechanical calculations by use of graduated scales capable of relative movement. It's an essential device used in many scientific and engineering fields. Really was used probably up until a couple of decades ago. I think helped NASA get to the moon. They didn't really have they had some computers, but it was mostly this kind of device and brain power that got them there. So it's a pretty powerful tool. So moving forward to the actual kind of first mechanical calculators, first one could probably that could be thought of as a calculator would be the calculating clock. Developed by William Shigard in the 1620s. It's capable of addition and subtraction for numbers up to 6 digits, but not very high powered. There's been some speculation that Da Vinci actually created an earlier version. They found some sketches of a possible device like a calculator, but that were able to be produced or reproduced by modern engineers, but that there's not hard evidence of that, I don't think. Blaise Pascal developed another model of a calculator in the 1640s and made about 50 copies, but it was not really widespread. So while these were around, they weren't really commonly used until the Industrial Revolution starting in the late 1700s and 1800s. Jacquard loom was a pretty important development, not only in the history of manufacturing of textiles, but also was noted by some to be the world's first information processing device. It was revolutionary at the time. Invented by French weaver Joseph Marie Jacquard in the 1800s. Device used paper cards, kind of punched with holes in a specific pattern, which were then placed in a machine. and which allowed for really complex fabrics to be made. You could say that the device was able to be programmed for different patterns depending on which kind of sets of cards were used and placed in the machine. So there's like a picture of the loom on the right, and then on the middle is one of the kind of punch cards with a specific pattern that was used. And then on the left is one of the really complicated fabrics, or complex fabrics that was created, which is pretty groundbreaking at the time. So after, moving on, another, I don't know if it was a huge development, was a significant development, was the kind of the idea for the difference engine. It was a device that was designed by Charles Babbage, famous English scientist, mathematician. It wasn't actually fully built because it was so resource intensive, and it required a lot of funding, which was kind of sporadic at the time. So it wasn't really fully developed as he would have liked. It was one of the first devices capable of storage, a place where data could be held for further calculations, which is obviously really important for computing today. Designed, it was going to be massive, going to take up the size of a whole room, but again, wasn't fully built and eventually discontinued in 1833. Babbage worked on another project which also wasn't completed. And he kind of started working on this thing called the analytical engine after the previous project was discontinued. This design would have been pretty amazing, designed to hold up to 1,050 digit numbers and would have had more capacity built than any machine built up until 1960. So pretty crazy for the time. The way it was designed had a lot of was pretty analogous to modern computers. It had this thing. It was supposed to have this thing called a mill, which was like a calculating unit, kind of similar to a central processing unit today. It's also going to have a store, a reader, and a printer. So similar to the Jacquard loom, it was supposed to use these punch cards with specific patterns on them, which kind of corresponded to programming instructions for calculations. Again, not actually built, but could be called, the design is the first, probably device that could actually be called a computer. Moving on into the late 19th century, the use of punch card devices was growing. There's this device called a census tabulator. It was developed in the 1870s by Herman Hollerith. So, recording census data, it's a pretty complex task. There are, millions of people. You have to record demographic data. It was very laborious. So, this device kind of expedited things quite a bit and was pretty helpful for that. Moving on to, modern day computing. Really, the two of the earliest kind of, computers in the modern sense were developed in Cambridge, Massachusetts at MIT and Harvard. There's a computer scientist, mathematician, Vannevar Bush, who developed an early analog computer at MIT called the differential analyzer. I was able to solve some calculus equations, which is pretty groundbreaking for that time. And then across town was Howard Aiken, who worked with IBM, or International Business Machines, which is obviously still around today. Worked in the late 30s, early 40s to develop the Mark I digital calculator, which was pretty advanced. It ended up being used by the Navy to develop kind of some ballistic calculations, and also had a minor role in development of the Manhattan Project, which was, of course, the development of the atomic bomb in New Mexico. So that's the picture of the Mark I back in the 40s. That's one of the mathematicians who worked on the development of the project. Grace Hopper ended up being a Navy Rear Admiral, pretty high rank. Other early modern computers include the Colossus, which some of you all may have heard of before. It's this set of very large computers used during World War II to kind of break some of the to decipher some of the transmissions that were being sent for war purposes by the German military and government officials. Alan Turing, a famous computer scientist, had a pretty significant role in this. Other early computers include the ENIAC, which is the electronic numerical integrator and computer, developed at University of Pennsylvania with U.S. government funding. Many early projects that had primarily military applications early on, was used for computing artillery range tables. It also played in the subsequent development of the hydrogen bomb. The UNIVAC, another major project, stands for the Universal Automatic Computer. Initially designed for processing commercial data and intended to replace punch card reading machines, which were commonly used for business and accounting purposes. Here's a picture of the Colossus. Like most of these early computers, they're just massive. They took up entire rooms worth of space. Very large moving parts and pretty complex, and required a lot of people to operate them, a lot of very specific expertise. Here's an interesting kind of aside about the UNIVAC. It was actually used to make predictions about the 1952 presidential election between Dwight Eisenhower and Adlai Stevenson. It made a pretty early prediction on the night of the election, based on I think early returns or exit polls or something, and predicted a Eisenhower landslide victory, which ended up being the case. However, the producers at CBS were really unsure that this would happen, and they were kind of skeptical of the results, so they actually didn't disclose that over the air. And they kind of, thought that it would be closer than it actually was, and it ended up being a landslide, and the computer was correct, which is interesting. Another major kind of development in computing history was the development of programming languages. When your early computers used pretty much just mathematical forms to be able to, you had to use those to be able to use them. But then you began to see this transition away from that and into these languages that were easier to access and easier for people with less expertise to use. One of the first was Plan Calcul, developed by the German computer scientist Konrad Zuse. Was used for mathematical operations. Another one was Fortran, which was developed by IBM in the early 50s. As well as COBOL, or the Common Business Language, which had wide use in the business community. From there, probably the next major development was microprocessors, originally developed for use in calculators, but later used in home computers. Greatly reduced the amount of space needed for computers and increased processing speed over time. Also led to a reduction in the cost of the components, as it allowed for more widespread adaptation. Widespread use, I should say. In the late 60s and 70s, you started to see the development of personal computers. These were very expensive at the time. They were pretty groundbreaking. They allowed people to be able to use them at home and in their offices. First models include the Altair 8800, the Apple I, Commodore PET, and the Commodore 64. Commodore 64 is a pretty famous one. Obviously, over the last several decades, we've seen this kind of increasing improvement in the quality of computers in terms of speed and abilities, as well as increasing improvement in the quality of internet speed and bandwidth and things like that. So pretty overall pretty rapid increase over the last century in computer power. So finally, moving on to how this kind of applies to mental health, I thought it was important to kind of lay a groundwork about the technology. The term telemedicine was a term initially coined by Kenneth Bird, who was a internist pulmonologist in Boston in the 1970s. He coined the phrase in 1970. It means healing at a distance. It's a combination of the Greek word tele, meaning far, far off, and Latin medicus for physician. He coined this after he developed this clinic at Boston Logan Airport and had like a video conference connection between his office at Massachusetts General and the airport. So he could kind of staff cases without the need for the patients to come over to the hospital. And this was supposed to be used for like emergent situations for travelers and airport personnel. So that's how the phrase was coined. But the actual beginnings of telemedicine, you could probably say, date back even further to Willem Einthoven, the Dutch physiologist and Nobel Prize winner who developed the first practical EKG. So back in 1905, a very long time ago, he developed the first kind of what's called a telecardiogram. And this was an EKG that was recorded using a string galvanometer and then sent by a telephone wire from a laboratory to a hospital in Leiden, the Netherlands. So obviously EKGs were probably more primitive at those times, but it was probably the first example of the application of telemedicine in that way. During the 1920s, Norwegian officers would correspond by radio to sick crew members out on the ocean and were able to give them medical advice. So that's another early application of telemedicine. And then we've already discussed Kenneth Bird set up his remote clinic between Boston Logan Airport and the Massachusetts General Hospital. So here's kind of like an early, I guess, kind of popular conception about how telemedicine may be practiced in the future, called the radio doctor. This magazine's still around, actually. It's now called Popular Mechanics. You may have heard of it. What's kind of interesting is I guess the child places some sensors on his chest there and gets evaluated remotely by the physician who's in his office. All right, so actually now we're moving into actually the subject of mental health. So I'd say the first really telepsychiatric operation was in 1959 at the Nebraska Psychiatric Institute. They set up a two-way closed circuit microwave television, provide individual long-term therapy and group therapy between the State Psychiatric Hospital located in Norfolk, Nebraska, and psychiatric offices in Omaha, Nebraska. And this is around pretty significant distance, 112 miles away. There was some cooperation from the Bell Telephone Company, which assisted in setting it up. The setup also was helpful for educating residents and students in mental health and nursing fields. So they're able to provide lectures remotely. Here's here's kind of someone working on the operation at the time at their setup. Again, these early these early telepsychiatry kind of arrangements were very large, very cumbersome, very expensive to operate. Required a lot of expertise. Another early telepsychiatry kind of development was there was a project to set up a consultation service between Dartmouth, the mental health center in Hanover, New Hampshire, to Claremont General Hospital, around 20 miles away, by use of a two-way closed-circuit television. So those were two, like the early developments. Both of these programs are later dismantled in the 70s due to large costs that was associated with them, and there was some physician resistance to use them as well. These are largely government funded, and the funding ended up drying up. So, there was this kind of early phase of telepsychiatry developments, which met a lot of roadblocks. There was difficulty with licensing, limited reimbursements. These modalities weren't really studied very much, and people didn't know if they worked. There wasn't enough bandwidth to be able to provide the services. The equipment was very costly, was another impediment. And then there were some early concerns about privacy protection, which still continue. So after that, in the late 80s and 90s, you started to see more kind of a second wave of telepsychiatry projects. These were both on the state and federal level. And this was able to be, these were able to be done due to improvements in telecommunications bandwidth and computing power. There were a lot of these, include the Texas Telemedicine Network, AppleLink project in Virginia, Northern Arizona Behavioral Health Project, and then among others. The VA was kind of an early pioneer in using telepsychiatry. They developed a strong interest in telemedicine in the 1990s and actually established the Telemedicine Strategic Healthcare Group in the mid-90s, 97. VA was also an early pioneer in the use of electronic medical records. So one of the early studies showing the, efficacy of modern telepsychiatry is conducted through the VA by Godleski and Darkins. Showed pretty positive results. Study looked at had a lot of participants. It looked at over 98,000 veterans before and after they enrolled in telemental health services between the years 2006 and 2010. The study showed that there was a 24.2% decrease in psychiatric admissions in the group and a 26% decrease in the amount of days hospitalized on psychiatric units. It was thought that this was probably due to increased access to services and the ability of physicians to intervene quicker, make recommendations or changes to prevent hospitalization. So moving forward again, the early 2000s, there was a significant increase in speed and bandwidth by internet providers. Started moving to more high-speed fiber optic internet. There was a rapid increase in the development of video conference technologies like Skype, GoToMeeting, things we're all probably familiar with. There were also some improvement in insurance reimbursement. These things led to more widespread use of telepsychiatry. So where are we today, and how is it practiced today? Probably the most common way is the use of telepsychiatry for outpatient visits, increasingly used. Patients are seen remotely by a provider via video conference, and maybe the patients can be located at a variety of places. They may be at another health facility, such as a doctor's office, a mental health center, a nursing home, or possibly even their own home. So it offers a lot of flexibility, offers a lot of decreased need for travel time for the patients, which would be helpful. There's also been an increase in the use of cloud computing services and smaller, more portable kind of systems to practice telepsychiatry, and kind of a move away from these larger fixed units. Like we have one in our HCOC office, the large telepsychiatry room. I believe that's a VTC. Yeah. as I mentioned, can be helpful to decrease the time, the travel time for patients coming to the office. Has many applications in different kinds of psychiatry, community mental health, private practice, and academic psychiatry. So there's been a large increase in the number of private companies over the last decades that offer telepsychiatry services. Some of the leading companies are Insight, Iris, Genoa, American Well, and PMC, among several others. Companies may have agreements with physicians to provide services in their state or in different states, depending on the licensing arrangements, for an agreed upon compensation, usually like an hourly rate. It's pretty nice because it offers a lot of flexibility with regard to time, patient load, and services provided. So it gives the physician a lot of leeway about how they want to practice. Companies sometimes use locum tenens contracts with physicians to provide services to areas that need them, or where there are a shortage of providers. Academic psychiatric centers such as ours have also increased the amount of telehealth services provided over the last several years. And we've seen an increase in the number of residency programs that are actually incorporating telemedicine into the core curriculum of skills or competencies that are needed. Like we do in our fourth year, we have our telemedicine clinic, which is pretty cool. Academic centers often provide services to other parts of their state or region where there are fewer mental health providers, also like we do here. Examples of, and this is just a few, these are just a few examples of the universities that have established telepsych centers. Obviously us, University of Hawaii, Virginia, Cal Davis is a big proponent of telepsychiatry. East Carolina, West Virginia, Virginia Commonwealth, among many others. Community mental health center, health providers have adopted telehealth technology at an increasing rate. We see this in Kentucky. Here's a map of just our community mental health providers. I know we work with 7 counties, River Valley, and Adonta. I would imagine that a lot of the other health centers in the state probably use telepsychiatry as well. So the use of telepsychiatry in emergency settings is growing. I think Dr. Lombardi presented on this topic a couple of months ago. Very interesting. There are a lot of EDs in the country are rurally located. They have a really hard time attracting psychiatrists to work there. So this can lead to delays in patients being evaluated if they have a psychiatric issue, which can obviously lead to increases in length of stay and cost. Telepsych can reduce wait times for patients, can reduce ED crowding, reduce costs and admissions. That was shown in a paper written in 2015. Also seem to have pretty high patient satisfaction ratings. The patients are okay being seen through telepsych. They're pretty comfortable with it. Another major application of the technology is as in the forensic and correction settings. There's a huge need for mental health providers in the prison system. There's a very high percentage of incarcerated people have a mental health diagnosis of some sort. I'm not exactly sure the exact percentage, but it's pretty crazy. Following the deinstitutionalization movement back in the 60s and 70s, there's this transition from patients who had been in state mental health hospitals out into the community, and a lot of them didn't have the resources or capabilities to function, and ended up being incarcerated. So the prison system kind of by default became a large provider of mental health services up until the modern day. So telepsych can be one way to kind of improve access to care, improve continuity of care in the prison system, and as well as decreasing the cost. Another application is consult liaison. This is kind of similar to the ED emergency department slide. A lot of hospitals are rurally located. They don't have psychiatrists to work there and evaluate patients. And again, this can lead to delays, inappropriate management at times, increased costs, etc. So obviously, telepsych is a way to reduce these issues and improve outcomes potentially. The use of telepsych in inpatient settings is not as widespread as some of the other areas that we discussed. In the past, issues with reimbursement have been a roadblock, but this is probably changing. The use of the inpatient model holds potential for improvement in rural areas and other underserved areas. Could also use telepsych for certain settings in which there are staff shortages, kind of like locums, I guess, like on weekends, holidays, nights, or when somebody's provider's taking an extended leave of absence. This is not a very commonly used application of telepsych, but it is something that is being studied. It's the use of telepsychiatry for the practice of MAT, or medication-assisted treatment, and mostly Suboxone. So a study done in 2017 from West Virginia conducted a 2-year retrospective analysis comparing treatment outcomes between telepsychiatry and face-to-face MAT for opiate use disorder with Suboxone. The study showed no significant difference in terms of 3 different outcomes: abstinence time, average time to achieve 30 and 90 consecutive days of abstinence, and treatment retention rates at 3 months and a year when comparing the telepsych to the face-to-face modalities. This was a pretty small study. I think there were only like 200 patients or something like that. But it is interesting, and as we all know, the opiate crisis is huge. So another possible tool to kind of combat that might be helpful, although this still doesn't really reduce the need for providers in these areas. Another interesting kind of use of telepsychiatry, not really commonly used a whole lot, but has certainly been studied, is the asynchronous model, which is also known as the stored forward model. It's where interview or evaluation of a patient is recorded and then reviewed at a later time by a psychiatrist. And if you think about it, there are a lot of other fields of medicine that have been using the asynchronous model for decades at this point. Think about radiology, cardiology, pathology, dermatology. Radiologists still see some kind of imaging done at a probably maybe hours earlier, and then make an evaluation based on what he or she sees. Similar in pathology and dermatology, they'll get a biopsy and then kind of make an evaluation later on, and then provide treatment recommendations or whatever to the treating physician. So why not use this in psychiatry? One benefit is that it offers a lot of flexibility to providers with regard to time. One study showed a potential decrease in cost with the asynchronous model due to the decreased amount of time that the provider actually spends with the evaluation. And then there was a third study which looked at using automatic translation software in the asynchronous model. They looked at a Spanish to English translation, and they found pretty good results. It also kind of decreased costs because it would decrease the need or eliminate the need for a translator, which could be helpful. There's just a kind of a diagram of how the asynchronous model works. a patient would see their primary care provider, who, they would make some kind of psychiatric complaint of some sort, and then the primary care provider would have them be interviewed by either themselves or another kind of tech who would do a kind of an evaluation with a large number of questions, to be obviously recorded. The video would then be sent to the psychiatrist who would review the recordings, write a note, make recommendations, and then send that note back to the primary care provider. Obviously, this wouldn't be, you couldn't use this in like emergent situations, but it would be, could be of potential use in patients with like anxiety or depression that are non-emergent or chronic. Moving on to another interesting subject is the use of mental health smartphone apps. There's been an explosion in the number of smartphone apps over the last decade with thousands of different uses. I thought this was pretty interesting. There were over, back in 2 years ago, there were over 165,000 healthcare related apps. I would imagine it's even higher now. And of the subcategory of medical related apps, the mental health, the subcategory was among the most popular. We're probably all somewhat familiar with some of the apps. They can be used to kind of educate patients on breathing techniques for use when they're feeling anxious. And also be used to monitor medication compliance, record mood and thoughts, symptom questionnaires, positive coping skills, etc. So, one of the problems is, there are all these apps. How do you know which ones are worth using and which ones are, are not good? And it can be, and there's not a lot of, there hasn't been a lot of studies done on these, on apps so far. So, you're kind of, can be difficult to make, recommendations to patients. So a group out of Harvard did a study back in 2016, which kind of suggested using a kind of a system to evaluate the quality of apps, and it's called the ASPECT system. It stands for actionable, secure, professional, evidence-based, customizable, and transparent. Actionable, meaning, if you're collecting information about a patient, like their mood or their thoughts, can you actually look at that data with the patient and then make recommendations for change based on that? Secure, it's pretty obvious. Is it free from, third-party interference? Professional, do the apps, are they in line with, ethical guidelines and professional guidelines that we have in psychiatry? Evidence-based, do they make recommendations that have been, validated by the literature? Customizable, can you tailor them to the individual patient where they might be more likely to actually use them? And transparent, is the app being used are there not any ulterior motives, like extracting data for use that can be then sold to advertisers or things like that, which often occurs. So that's just kind of like one set of guidelines that might be helpful in when you need to make a decision to recommend an app or not. Another interesting, I guess, kind of phenomenon that I read about is this thing called the digital placebo effect. There was a paper from 2012 which showed a possible effect, looked at mood outcomes when using a mood monitoring app for patients with depression. So the paper found positive outcomes, which were measured by the use of the depression, anxiety, stress scale and the emotional self-awareness scale in patients who use the app, even though there's no direct intervention from a clinician. So basically they were just kind of recording how they felt and their mood over time. And the app didn't make any specific recommendations for them. They didn't see a psychiatrist or anything like that. But when the study was over, they still reported feeling better. The authors, speculated about why this might be the case. beliefs about technology, perceptions of being more connected to healthcare providers through remote monitoring, design of the app itself, and information provided to participants are just some examples of potential contributors to the digital placebo effect, though none have been well characterized. Right, so we've talked about some of the history of telemedicine, telepsychiatry. We've talked about how it's practiced today. Where might we be heading in the future? What might this look like a few years down the road? One potential development is this kind of, I guess, technique or practice called digital phenotyping. One definition is the moment-by-moment quantification of the individual level human phenotype in situ using data from personal digital devices. So, if you think about it, our cell phones and our devices collect tons of information about us. For a New York Times article that, they found that patients touch their cell phones over 2,600 times a day. This includes like tap and typing and swiping and all those, behaviors. In addition to that, it also records a lot of other information. It's linked to GPS, so it can find out your physical location, has voice recording capabilities, obviously connections to social networks such as Facebook, Twitter, etc. Can probably measure it can measure your voice volume, your rate of speech, and patterns of interaction with others. So these devices can potentially be used to monitor symptoms such as decreased sleep, increase in number of phone calls or messages, decreases in physical activity, which, in combination with other expressions of emotional change, which can be measured by content or length of messages, expressions of suicidal ideation, grandiosity, could help identify psychiatric patient problems. So, perhaps somebody's in a manic state. They're not sleeping. They're writing these long, rambling messages. They're, doing this bizarre behavior. It could cue in that the patient is, in need of an intervention or some kind of psychiatric help. There's a pretty significant risk of misuse, and I think there's probably it's probably good to be skeptical to some degree of how this would be implemented based on recent things we've seen from other social networks, and should be used with caution, I think. Another potential kind of development, and really it's something that's already being used, is the use of VR devices, virtual reality. These could be a very of significant help in treatment of patients with various psychiatric disorders such as PTSD, phobias, psychotic disorders. Patients could use the VR devices to kind of create artificial environments where they could receive therapeutic interventions to help them overcome their specific issues. Like maybe somebody who's like arachnophobic or something, and or any other kind of specific phobia could confront this in an artificial environment, which is, perhaps a bit less stressful for them, and then can work on ways to overcome those anxieties and then be better equipped to deal with them in real life. Could also be used in patients with social anxiety, getting them to go out in public settings and kind of being able to simulate those in VR. So successful treatment would allow patients to change their behavior in the real world environments through practice in the VR environments. A couple other potential areas that this might be helpful are in patients who with autism. Can help them, educate them in teaching emotional recognition and communicate with other people better. Could be of use for people with alcohol or substance use disorders. Have them they simulate going to a bar or something like that, and ways to avoid temptation to use alcohol or something. There's also the potential for the use of avatars in therapy. Maybe if a patient is a significant trauma history, and they're, and the therapist is like a large male or something, that you could obviously see where that might make them uncomfortable. if they, therapists could perhaps use an avatar that's less threatening, they might be able to better engage in the therapy. It could be helpful. Here's just a couple of photos showing VR. I think the one on the right looks pretty old. I don't know about that one, but this is an area that's growing rapidly and is going to continue to get more sophisticated and more. It's pretty interesting. The increasing use of AI be a potential help in mental health. There are already these things called chatbots, which are interactive programs designed to simulate conversation with human users. A lot of these are currently used in business applications and social media, but they could be used in people with psychiatric issues. One that's already on the market is Wobot, which I haven't personally evaluated, so I can't say too much about it. But it is designed for people with depression, anxiety issues, and makes use of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy techniques. Another chatbot was Kareem, which is an Arabic language app recently used to help recognize and deal with emotional distress. So was provided to some refugees of the war in Syria with some beneficial outcomes noted. So this technology is likely to continue to improve, continue to get more sophisticated. There are already examples of this on a really high level, like Apple Siri, Amazon's Alexa, Watson, which won Jeopardy a couple years ago. So it's getting better and better. Technology can also be used to recognize emotional distress, language, voice, affect recognition, and other concerning symptoms, and provide feedback and therapy. So where is this all going to lead? What are we going to look like in a century? What will mankind look like? Some people suggest that we're giving rise to this other more kind of sophisticated artificial intelligence, kind of like we evolved from more less kind of sophisticated forms. So we're just kind of like in this continual transition. So if that occurs, hopefully it's end up looking benevolent, like these examples of helpful robots in Japan, like the one on the right that's used in nursing homes for the elderly, and this one which assists patients with mobility issues. Hopefully it will not look like these guys, which would be scary. What are some potential concerns for the use of telepsychiatry or technology in mental health in general? There's a decrease in face-to-face interaction. You're not physically in the room with them, which some people, which could be a concern. Potential for disconnection in service. Maybe you're talking with a patient and it's, they're talking about something really important, and then there's like a interruption of your internet connection, which could be obviously not good. So that's an issue. In the past, reimbursement's been a pretty significant issue, though this is improving. There's potential for loss of continuity of care. In some applications you could see where a patient may be seeing different providers every time, which would not, be ideal. And then obviously there are privacy concerns, which are pretty well founded based on recent things we've seen in social media and various companies. So those are, potential things to be aware of and problems to address. These are my sources. And just some acknowledgments. Thanks to a lot of people to thank. Obviously, my family, the patients who I've learned so much from. Dr. Cadell kind of got me interested in this subject, and got me motivated to kind of look at these kinds of things. My supervisors over the years, Dr. Roberts, Dr. O'Connor, Dr. Strauss, Dr. Stewart, as well as the rest of the faculty that I've worked with. Christy's always so helpful. She helped me again today get set up, and my fellow residents. It's all been very pretty cool. Nice 4 years. So thank you very much.